I pull up the official title of this. Sorry, 2 seconds. Alright, hi everyone. Welcome to the panel discussion on casualization, marketisation, and the future of higher education. This panel is part of our week of awareness, where we're talking about issues of casualization of graduate student employment, marketisation of education, and the work of UCU in the sector. I'm really glad to be joined by our 3 panelists here. We have Jade, Safa, and Izzy, and I'm going to quickly let them all introduce themselves. I'm Anvi, by the way. I'm the president of Oxford SU. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a human sciences student at Magdalen College. Do you want to start?
Yeah, hi, I'm Jade, she, they. I'm the Class Act co-chair and next year's VP for Access and Academic Affairs, and I'm a 3rd year history student at Wadham.
Hi, I'm Safa. I did history at Oxford, and now I'm the current SU sabbatical officer for Access and Academic Affairs.
Hi, I'm Izzy. I'm currently a DPhil student at Oxford, and I've been in Oxford quite a long time.
Amazing. So we're sort of going to start first with the casualization side of things, and I'd love to hear more from Izzy about this. Izzy, as a DPhil student, what do you feel about the future of potentially working in academia?
I feel like if you work in academia, especially to start with, it's quite a lot of temporary contracts. So you end up moving to like postdocs for a year. You often have very little choice on where you move to, and then after a year it's often like getting the next job is about how much you publish or write papers, and then you have to basically go find another job. So it's quite a high pressured environment, and there's very little job security at that point. And so you can end up with people just going for perpetual postdocs but never actually getting a permanent job, which is obviously really negative. And I think if you're in a financial situation where you can afford to do that, then that's one thing, but otherwise it's very difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is where the word casualization kind of comes in. And I think we've seen this word thrown around a lot when referring to jobs in the academic sector. There have been Guardian op-eds, for instance, on how the academic sector is turning into a gig economy. What does casualization mean to you, and how do you think it might impact you?
I feel that, at least for me, it would be one reason that I wouldn't stay in academia. I think that the lack of job security combined with various environments in the field would put me off staying. And I think that that's true for quite a few people, where people are probably gifted enough in the subject to stay, but the environment and sort of the fact that you'll keep on having to switch jobs very quickly puts a lot of people off.
Yeah, absolutely. So with all of this, what do you think is the solution to the problem of casualization? It's quite a big one, but I think specifically, how do you think we can improve job security for our academic staff?
I think that probably casualization starts when you leave your undergrad and start with the DPhil, where admittedly now some research councils have like sick leave and various things that would kind of be sort of mandated if you have a job, but that's not widespread across the board. So even in other countries like Germany, if you become a DPhil student, then you're like a member of employees, which means that you have all the protections associated with that. But that's not the case in the UK. So I think that probably that they need to start from that early on, just thinking about giving people at least semi-permanent contracts. But then when you're getting to postdoc level, I think sort of giving people a reasonable amount of time to be a postdoc at somewhere with a kind of idea to like progress somebody and sort of develop them as a person, rather than doing a measurement of like performance and saying the only reason you're staying is because you've published X number of papers in X journal. Because it just like kind of means that people don't do what they want to research, they do what they know is going to get published somewhere, and typically early career researchers then forced into like easy wins, which sometimes actually prohibits, for example, science, where actually the really hard problems it's going to be really hard to publish anything in 2 years. And so it ends up with people not actually doing what would be best for everyone involved.
Yeah, absolutely. So you've been involved as a member of UCU, which is one of the sort of trade unions in the higher education sector. Do you want to tell me a bit about, first of all, what UCU does, what your involvement has been like, and potentially what advice you might be able to give someone who's been looking to get involved but hasn't yet?
Yeah, I mean, the University and College Union kind of is a union that represents people that work at universities and higher education institutes and colleges. And they've had various campaigns for a long time to do with higher education. And obviously, some of the things like going on strike are very difficult as a DPhil student, but people can act in support of them. And if various reasons, if people do have contracts, then they can obviously help with that. In terms of my involvement, I've not been that involved with them. I have a lot of friends that are very actively involved and do, for example, postdocs and things that have been involved in striking, where they've actually got a permanent contract. But yeah, it's something, it's still worth joining and being a member of, even if you're not a member of staff yet.
Yeah, and you mentioned specifically you being a DPhil student. How do you think casualization specifically affects graduate students like DPhil students? And have you kind of personally heard of any cases or experienced sort of the harms associated with casualization?
Yeah, I think as a DPhil student, unlike most undergraduate students, there is kind of a teaching element of most people do some employment. Normally that's not like a formal contract where you're sort of employed for the number of years you're doing the DPhil for teaching, but rather it's a casual contract. And sometimes these casual contracts will pay X amount for a teaching session regardless of how long it takes to prepare for that session. So there are cases across the sciences where, for example, a session might take, it's only like a 2-hour session, but to do all the maths for it might take say 10, 20 hours to prepare all the stuff, but marking for the number of students that are going to attend, but they don't pay anywhere near that representative amount. So that's one big problem. And I guess for people that are trying to use that as a backup for funding, if you're sick or something, or it gets cancelled very quickly, then that's quite damaging to you because you kind of not got that security to know, like, if you're going to have that money and at any point they could cut it because it's not a formal contract. And so I think it causes a lot of uncertainty. And if anything this pandemic has taught us, uncertainty is not good for people's mental health or well-being, or like their finances, and so it's really negative.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we can sort of move on to the student side of things now, with Safa and Jade. So starting with Safa, in your time at Oxford, I'm sure you've seen several times different sorts of UCU strikes or staff members taking like action short of strike, things like that. What do you think when you see lecturers striking or staff members joining a trade union like UCU?
Yeah, I think it's great, and it's always really encouraging to see academic staff organising in that way. You know, it's something all workers should be doing, and it's like kind of where you can have the most power. And I know as a student it can be quite tempting to, you know, see strikes as against like students' interests. You know, it disrupts our teaching. But I think, like I as a student would always support strikes and always will, and I think that's what every student should do. It's, you know, it's the fight that we're in together. I know this has been like kind of a popular slogan lately, but I think it is a really good one. But kind of our tutors' working conditions are our learning conditions, and kind of details around tutors' contracts, what things in faculties get funding and what don't, like that directly impacts the kind of education we have. You know, it sets the priorities of what gets kind of filtered down into our teaching. And yeah, if you're, you know, frustrated by strikes, well, you know, the strikes could be stopped by the university's kind of senior managerial system, the kind of governance and head of universities, like vice chancellors. And I would say, you know, I would definitely say that tutors and students are on the same side, and that kind of university governing bodies aren't, the kind of vice chancellors, these managers at the top of universities that have never been on student side. I know last year we heard like absolute horror stories about some of the conditions students were having to return to during the pandemic. They're the same people increasing student numbers. It's kind of it's the same fight, and like I think tutors and students are definitely on the same side of that.
Yeah, absolutely. You alluded as well to kind of the potential short-term consequences this can have on students' education, but that you like still support the strikes regardless.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to elaborate a bit more on that and kind of how you think the strikes impact education long-term perhaps?
Yeah, sure. So I guess, in the short term, like I said, there's things like, certain modules being cut, less one-to-one teaching on casualised contracts, things like that. But in the long term, I think it's really about what kind of education and learning is prioritised and what education actually means. Such a big part of marketisation is commercial league tables and, like keyword market, like universities are marketing themselves as something that's on the market for consumers to kind of choose from. And I think that's no longer like education for learning and knowledge's sake. That's kind of, what types of education are measurable through KPIs or like things that we can show on a table, things that we can really easily show a consumer and like measure against each other, rather than how do we actually like properly aid the intellectual development of our students.
Yeah, absolutely. So Jade, you've obviously worked quite closely with the SU Class Act campaign during your time at university. And we know that jobs in the academic sector are hard to come by and don't pay very well. How do you think that impacts students from different class backgrounds, and kind of how do you see this taking a toll on the academic sector as a whole?
I think there's a very obvious answer to draw from this, and that it's very disproportionately affecting, I wouldn't even say working class or first generation students, the students who aren't from a very, very comfortably middle class background, I suppose, but and then the further down that, the more serious the situation is. I think for a lot of people I know, and including myself, even say doing a master's, you're thinking, will I be able to afford this, or will I have to factor in how small my postgraduate loan potentially could be, the limited funding, rising costs of living, and having to do a part-time job alongside it. Obviously, the part-time job thing is a common thing across undergraduate students as well. But the further up the kind of the stages in academia, I suppose, the more of a financial burden it is to kind of stay in there. And if it's pushing out working class academics or potential academics, then that's a problem, even in these kind of bureaucratic standards of measurement. You can say, well, actually, as flawed as this idea is, it's not quote unquote meritocratic if determined I don't infantilize people, these bright young people, but people who could be potentially great academics can't afford to be academics, then obviously that's an issue. And someone was just clapping in the background. Obviously that's an issue, and particularly with the humanities, where there is even less funding opportunities, when you go into DPhil for PhDs, I think it's very difficult to justify that as a career path, let alone the financial kind of the course fees, the instability, all that. It's just why do it if you can't afford to do it? And I really don't feel as if the government particularly cares, beyond the kind of the undergraduate level. And I don't even think they're particularly good for undergraduates, but I think we'll get onto that later.
Yeah, no, definitely. So speaking of funding, Safa, education obviously in the UK has not been free in quite some time, ever since tuition fees were introduced in sort of the 80s and 90s, compared to similar levels of higher education in other countries across Europe and the rest of the world being free. What do you think this means for students right now and potentially in the future? And also, what kind of bearing do you think this has on the values we hold as a society?
Yeah. Yeah, I guess obviously, you know, Jade has kind of touched on how money is like a very physical and immediate barrier for a lot of people pursuing higher education, especially, as you say, getting onto the kind of postgraduate level. But yeah, I guess it's also like maybe a bit more immaterial, like you say, and to do with values. It's kind of, yeah, I guess, you know, a lot of higher education policy reflects kind of the current government's understanding of what kind of education leads to what kind of jobs that kind of create this kind of production for like a productive economy. And kind of, you know, we already see things like the National Student Survey, the NSS. A lot of research shows that kind of, so just for example, just for explanation, that's a way to kind of see how universities are performing, kind of a way to compare the education that universities provide for their students against each other. But research has shown that like innovative and experimental types of teaching like don't do very well on those surveys, and especially teaching by minority academics, so whether that's academics who are women or more so academics who aren't white or aren't cis, their teaching happens to be doing really badly in those surveys. But I'm sure if you asked students about like the merit of that education, I think you'd get a very different answer. And we know that students are constantly asking more for that kind of education. Yeah, so I think you're right. It is a very much like values-based thing, and I think what it means is that education will only be measured by these kind of superficial market values rather than how it's actually impacting its students. There's also like a culture of students being made to identify with kind of with being a consumer and kind of, you know, what are these kind of superficial things that I can expect from my higher education provider, rather than thinking like more holistically about education. Does that answer the question? I kind of forgot half of it. But
Yeah, no, I think that definitely
Yeah.
does. I think you really touched on how this impacts society as a whole, and how education is kind of a way of looking at what we sort of value and
Yeah.
believe in.
Yeah.
Moving back to Jade, so Class Act again works quite a lot with first generation students, and you mentioned that finances have quite a significant burden on what level of education students are able to pursue. Do you maybe want to speak a bit more about what the financial burden of education currently looks like, and in an ideal world, what you'd like the burden or lack thereof to look like?
Yeah, so it was recently announced, I think, well, within the last few weeks, that the changes to the repayment of student loans for undergraduate students will change, the conditions of that will change. So I think the payment threshold is being lowered, and the way interest fees and things like that are calculated. I don't know off the top of my head, but it's not particularly kind. It's not quite as bad as America, from what I know, but it's, you know, certainly worse than the rest of Europe. So, students who normally, I think before you had to earn about £27,000 was the threshold, I want to say, and now, pardon?
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's
and now it's being lowered to, I want to say 20. Anyway, I can't remember the exact figures, but it's being lowered. So more students more graduates on lower incomes are having to pay essentially a graduate tax, which they will not pay off until they're in their 50s and 60s potentially. And you know, and the government has effectively, in my opinion, targeted young people and young graduates as to bear the brunt of rising taxes and so on and so forth, compared to perhaps wealthier older groups. So I know a lot of people, they think about university and they think, and I'm saying this particularly kind of like first gen or lower income students, they think, well, like, if I'm going to be saddled with this much debt, is it worth it? Which is not a question you want to ask about education. That's not the decision you want to be making. You want to think, you know, you want to view it from an experience. You know, what are you going to get out of it intellectually, academically, or, you know, vocational skills you're going to get out of it that you're going to enjoy and they're going to be enriching in your life. And again, it's the marketisation. You have to look at it as an investment, and I understand that point of view because you basically are. And I don't want to chastise people for thinking about it that way, because you're kind of forced to think about it that way as an investment, something you buy, something you have to kind of weigh up the pros and cons of in a kind of financial term, which, again, because if the government's forcing you to become a consumer, you know, you might as well be like, I might as well play the game as a consumer, which is depressing, but that is the reality for a lot of people. And you think on the flip side, like Safa was saying earlier, the moral, or perhaps moral is slightly kind of an intimidating word, but the philosophical kind of underpinnings of, like, should education be free? Is education a good, which we want to encourage in society? You know, that's in large part where the free tuition fees argument comes from. And I think also, so we should be kind of wary of moving away from that goal when people say things like, I want a tuition fee reduction, or I want a tuition fee rebate, for instance, you know, under how universities have handled COVID. They think, well, I haven't been taught properly, I want my money back. Again, you know, it's an obvious thing to sympathise with. You know, if you're not getting what you paid for, you want money back. But that kind of legitimises the idea that, you know, the principle of paying tuition fees, when really you should be saying, well, actually, the tuition fee model is not favourable towards lower income students, because lower income students take out more tuition fee loans, they have a higher, so they have to pay more back. You know, I know students who are like, oh, I didn't need a loan, or I took one out because, you know, I fancied some extra money, and the vast majority of students do not have that choice. You know, they're saddled with debt for the sin of wanting an education, and that is really the way we have to view things. The goal is the goal is absolutely to get rid of tuition fees. Yeah, and that's at an undergraduate level, I think. Postgraduate, it just gets compounded further as you go do more and more degrees, end up in more and more debt, or ultimately precarious work, as we've covered.
Yeah, definitely. I wholeheartedly agree with pretty much everything you said. So let's dive deeper into the word marketisation, which you dropped earlier, Safa. What does the word marketisation mean? What does it mean to you?
Yeah.
And when we look at creating a more equitable higher education system, what kinds of things would you like to see?
Sure. Yeah, so marketisation, again, is kind of, it's many things, but I think that's why it's terrifying. It's very all-encompassing. There's literally the fact that your education is something you have to buy, and it's sold on a market, and measured in the ways we talked about, has the kind of financial barriers that we've talked about. it's also the value thing we talked about, and it's also how kind of education and people are viewed within the institutions. You know, in the same way as I mentioned that students were hurried back onto campus and then locked away just so they were paying their rents to their universities, is exactly the same as the things that Izzy was talking about how workers aren't seen as, like academic staff aren't seen as people to invest in their people to kind of have these casual contracts with, to absolutely overwork and drain and then dismiss, rather than that kind of investment. And yeah, I think a lot of it is, you know, how students and staff are treated is to do with the fact that like the government and university management just see them as cash cows. Like there's, yes, like the pay gaps in academia are horrendous. Like it's worth mentioning for this panel since we haven't already. There's a gender pay gap, there's a massive pay gap between white and non-white academics, and there's like barely any progress year on year on these gaps. People on casualised contracts, UCU has done a lot of like surveys into this. The majority of them can't make big financial investments like owning a property, buying a house. Like, you know, you'd think being an academic would at least get you that. And yeah, some really upsetting things out of those surveys. There's even academics who've had to, who've struggled with homelessness and had to rely on food banks because of casualised contracts. So there's that kind of very like human people-based side of marketisation. But I think mostly what I would describe it as is kind of an alignment of education and what education looks like being solely based on the interests of university management, of the government, and essentially of capital. And so for me, what marketisation is that education is only allowed to function as would be in the best interest of capital.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better. I think especially for me, coming from America, I've noticed that regardless of how high tuition fees are, marketisation inevitably leads to the same consequences for academic staff.
Mm-hmm.
And in America, even though tuition fees are a lot higher and education is less subsidised, and you would think that money going directly from students to universities maybe allows professors and tutors to be paid better. It actually doesn't. A lot of the money gets lost in the middle through bureaucracy and middle management, and really you lose sort of the sole purpose of education, which is the relationship between students and academic staff and the work on research and all of that sort of thing. And finally, Jade, so we've talked about and seen how this government has perpetuated a lot of inequality, specifically in education inequality. And so how do you think that this inequality looks like specifically from the government side? And what, if anything, do you think the government could do to remedy the inequality in higher education?
Well, there's quite concrete things, like I've gone on about tuition fees. I think that is, a real supposed dividing line in marketisation versus viewing it as a public good. I think also student loans. We used to have maintenance grants, which were non-repayable. You got the money, you did what you want with it, and then loans were introduced. We used to have a system. In many ways, it was imperfect because there were fewer young people going to universities, fewer young people from less advantaged backgrounds going to university. But it wasn't, if I go to university, I'll be saddled with debt that I won't pay off for 40, 50 years. Potentially, they'll write it off after 50 years. So yeah, 50 years. and the corrosive nature of Marketisation wasn't quite as bad. I think we also, the government has very obviously undermined the importance of arts and humanities degrees and arts and humanities education generally over quite a few years now. It's very much if you don't do STEM, we're not going to support you, and courses will be cut because they're not financially viable at universities. And also, for instance, if you want to train as a teacher, if you want to be a physics teacher, you'll get all this money thrown at you, and that's great because we need physics teachers. But if you want to be a history teacher, you're not going to get quite as much money to kind of support you down that path. So the government explicitly does not value arts and humanities as much as STEM. But I think there's many reasons behind that, some more legitimate than others in terms of what their perspective in terms of, I don't know, cost-benefit analysis or whatever, I suppose. Not saying I agree with that, but I was just thinking from the government's perspective how much of this is ideological, being like people should not be doing dance degrees or Mickey Mouse degrees or whatever they want to call it, which is, you know, in itself, or how much of it is. Yes.
Yeah, we have a question from the audience, so let's take that.
I have two questions, actually it's one for each of you. So Safa, do you think that league tables are inherently problematic and inherently just unhelpful to how we see education?
Yeah, I think so. I think, you know, especially the way they exist at the moment within a marketized system, that's what they're part of, that's what they uphold. It's kind of, yeah, it's just another tool for universities to use to market themselves, to, yeah, use kind of superficial factors to measure themselves against each other. And, you know, I think I can maybe like assume that some people could say that they were kind of good for students, especially if their league tables are specifically on student experience and welfare provisions and things like that. But I would kind of say, you know, that's a very like small incremental change to the league table system, and that wouldn't really be fighting marketisation. What you want instead is kind of a education system that isn't about kind of government or profit incentives, but if it was actually, sorry, I'm being a bit different.
I have looked my title, is it here? Sorry, but it's not there. Sorry, I'm sorry. I'm really sorry.
Sorry, yeah, to answer your question, yeah, I think it would just be a lot more helpful if education in the first place was a bit more democratised and accessible and free, and then it would kind of represent students' interests anyway, because that profit incentive is like removed.
But don't you think it encourages universities to be better or try harder?
Yeah, I don't think it does. So for example, before the SU started boycotting the National Student Survey, Oxford used to perform very well in that, based on student experience, you know, especially in areas of student experience, of academic standards, of, you know, things that are seen as more student focused like that. Whereas having worked in the SU, that's absolutely not what you hear, and I'm sure like a lot of students would be shocked to hear that. You know, I don't think Oxford is, especially compared to the country, a student-focused university at all. I think academic standards here are probably worse than anywhere else because there is no standardisation with kind of tutorials, college systems, and so I think that, for me, I think once I knew that, I knew that there was like no hope for league tables over for the NSS.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
And then my other question was mainly for Jade, but for both of you. As someone who I really aligned with what you said earlier, and as someone who went to like a state comprehensive in a not so great area, and like coming to Oxford, a lot of my dream was like doing well enough in my degree, like as a consumer, to then go on and like make it big and like have enough money to like feel comfortable. And then on reflection of that, by the time I finished, I realized that wasn't what a degree is about. How do you think that, like, especially a lot of us who are like new to hearing about this idea of marketisation, how do you think we're going to challenge that? Because obviously there's probably still going to be, and this is for both of you if you'd like to answer, but there's still going to be kids from like working class backgrounds who are like, oh well, Oxford is the place where Oxford is the place where I go so I can get the connections and I can get like the degree that will make me really successful, even if it means I'm not having the best time in terms of welfare.
Yeah, I think that's a question which you can go down quite a lot of routes in.
Yeah.
You know, you can start off with like, well, what's the point of going to university? Is it to get an education and to, you know, learn things and be intellectually challenged? Is it a place to get a job, you know, at the end of it, make yourself employable, quote unquote? Or, you know, and with that comes the networking, that sort of thing. I think Oxford is interesting because I think, say if you took a university like LSE, and I'm going to say this without having ever studied at LSE, but I think at LSE it's a very, if you do like economics or something, it's a very sort of, not even LSE, but you know, a lot of universities might, maybe you do like a sandwich cook placement or something, so you do like a year in industry to make you employable. A lot of universities, in like YouTube adverts, I seem to always get like Leicester de Montfort University advertising to being like, we're really employable and, you know, we have a great career service. And that's because, you know, if you're a student and I guess at this point of the year you go through like clearing or something, that's something to latch onto. You'd be like, okay, that's why I'm going to university, because it will get me a good job. And I think if you're from a more economically precarious background, you know, it's very much like, you know, I have like an Asian mom, so she's like, you know, go to university, get a good job, do this, do that, make yourself employable. And I think you can't really get rid of that. I think people are always going to have that mindset. Not everyone wants to become an academic. Some people are going to go into business, some people are going to go into whatever. And I think to an extent, you can pass those two things. Like you can have opportunities for internships and networking and, you know, career service and that sort of thing, alongside a university academic experience which focuses on learning for learning's sake. I think to an extent, Oxford is quite good at that. And that's why I compared it to like LSE, where everyone's very sort of like that kind of mind, not everyone, but a lot of people are more that kind of like employability mindset. I think Oxford is very, you know, you can choose to kind of ignore the employability bit, quote unquote, you know, go into all these like networking things if you don't want to, you can just focus on your degree. And I think it is an inevitability under kind of, because people, you know, not everyone's going to want to go into academia or have that kind of, I suppose it's idealistic in a sense, and I don't see idealistic as meaning unachievable or, you know, unrealistic, but it's idealistic, but that doesn't mean it should be like dismissed or discouraged under government policy. I don't know if I've fully answered your question, but I think we have to be realistic about what students come into university wanting. But also, you know, not be totally beholden to like students who go to this university earn £30,000 after 2 years. 96% of students are in full-time employment, and it's like, well, but did they have a good time? Were they taught well? X, Y, Z. it's not just about that, and you could have. It's quite a big question. People are like, well, what's the point of university? In Oxford in particular, is the point of Oxford to just come here and do your degree and then whatever you choose to do, or is Oxford there to kind of shape decision makers and elites and that sort of thing? And I think you particularly see that with postgraduate degrees, that from the business school and that sort of thing, where MBAs and MPPs, I want to say, are tens of thousands of pounds, and that's that really does not seem very accessible on the face of things economically, and they're for a certain sort of person with a certain sort of means to an end, which that means to an end isn't quite there if you're, doing just a maths degree or a history degree at undergraduate level. I think that's where that question is even more relevant at Oxford.
Yeah, I really like that you touched on the point of education being sort of either education for education's sake or education as a stepping stone to a job or money or whatever it is. And I think we've really moved from the former to the latter, which I don't think is necessarily a good thing, because it reflects sort of on our society what value we place on education. And if we just use it as a stepping stone to something further, we kind of forego the inherent value of learning, of a lot of humanities degrees which keep sort of the arts and things alive. We sort of move away from that into more employable things, because we view education as a transactional relationship between our money and our time and potential job opportunities in the future.
I think if you view it that way, you definitely do end up losing out on things, and you can see that by which faculties end up being defunded. But I guess what I just wanted to add is I think it's just a question about choice of students will obviously want different things out of their university, and that's fine, but I think the point is that students shouldn't have to be making these decisions about is what I want to do because I enjoy it and sound investment and things like that, and it doesn't have to be either or. I would hope that you could have a university experience where you develop intellectually, you have a good time, you're looked after and cared for, and then it also helps you get the future job that you want. I think you can have it all.
Yeah. On that note, let's move on to the final question, which will be the same for both of you. And that's around what can we do from here? So what do you think we can do about marketisation and casualisation as students? What direct action can students take to get involved on sort of combating these issues? And what do you see as the future for action on these?
Sure. So I think the first thing is really I know it sounds very big and scary and complicated, and I know part of this panel was what does marketisation actually mean? But I really think whatever you're campaigning for as a student, engaging with marketisation or seeing how it fits is something really useful and can sometimes help you get to the root of the issue. For example, a lot of what I've done this year with students is work with student groups who've been campaigning for things like reading weeks, things like assessment policy support packages to as a kind of safety net because of disruptions to teaching during the pandemic. And I think one thing that was really useful to kind of think about is that a lot of the reasons Oxford doesn't want to do kind of things that would seemingly be very good for students' welfare and mental health and actually help them academically is because Oxford has this idea of its academic integrity that it kind of has to uphold. And when you actually interrogate what that idea is, well, that's just a product to sell, that we're Oxford and we have an academic integrity that is different to other institutions, and therefore that kind of product that it's trying to push, that commodity is directly the reason that policies that would help students aren't being put in. So I would really encourage students to think about how marketisation fits into whatever they're kind of campaigning for, what their issues are. And then in terms of what you can do, there's so many things. At the SU, we're encouraging a boycott of the National Student Survey. I've talked about league tables already here today and some of the problems with that survey, but there's more information on our website. But yeah, we're really encouraging all finalists to not fill that out. If you've already filled that out but don't want to, don't worry. There's instructions on our website about how to rescind your response. It's really easy. You just have to send them an email. We've got a template. Support strikes wherever you see them happening. Come to picket lines. Ask tutors what you can do. Ask striking tutors what support they need. Maybe you can organise teach-ins or activities at the picket line to kind of bring people there. And what was that? Common rooms? Should what? Do you want to say something? Common rooms, what can common rooms do? Okay, common rooms can talk to their senior tutors and their principals and urge them to get in contact with, maybe the Vice Chancellor, I don't know. You're allowed to hold your university to account in terms of how they're treating academic staff. You can absolutely do that. I don't think it would, I said it kind of laughingly, but I don't think it would be inappropriate at all for students to want to write to Vice Chancellors about these issues if you care about them. I don't know, maybe organise a panel, I'm sure there's those things to do.
Yeah, turning it over to Jade, same question.
Yeah, no, I think support striking staff, wise up by watching this video, for example.
Share this video.
Share, share, subscribe.
Comment down below.
What do you think about
you? And that. Learn about the issues specifically to Oxford as well in particular. I mean, obviously, widely, generally. But I think if you look at Oxford, it's quite shocking because you would have thought it's somehow better than other universities because it's got more money and it can support staff better. No, it really can't. The level of kind of precarious work for academic teaching staff is. Someone told me it's the worst, but I don't know if that's true. But it's definitely not got a good record of casualisation of staff. And also, I think we can extend the issue of inequality and things like that beyond just teaching staff. When you look at the Oxford living wage, for example, a lot of colleges, most colleges, I won't sugarcoat it, don't pay their staff the Oxford living wage so they can afford to live in the city, to a decent standard of living. And Oxford is a very expensive, unequal city. When I say student staff solidarity, I don't just mean academic staff. I say, I think it's not easy, but I think we often talk about academic staff because they're often the ones on UCU picket lines, and some of us may potentially want to go into academia, so we are clued up on those ideas, and those problems. But a lot of staff in this university and within colleges are not paid appropriately for the work that they do. Get engaged with that. Get engaged with the UCU striking staff. Staff who are speaking up on this sort of thing. Speak to colleges. Get involved with SU initiatives to support them. Do things like the NSS boycott. Little things will add up to show that Oxford, the student body, are against these practices. And we want to see an alternative. Because I think I hate the fact that this is true, but I think, if Oxford does something, it makes waves compared to, say, perhaps, other universities, and that's not a good thing, but, you've got to think about that, and unfortunately Oxford did not meet the threshold to go out on strike at the ECU ballot, so we won't have the picket lines and the sort of the physical manifestation of organised action that some other universities do. You know, if you have friends at other universities, talk to them about what they're doing. Get involved with like teach outs. A lot of them probably pass now because it's late, but you know, initiatives that show solidarity, I think, is one of the biggest things you can do.
Yeah, I think on that I'd really encourage students to remember that the student movement is a national movement, and just because Oxford isn't striking doesn't mean that there aren't other things going on. Ambi and I went to the NUS student strike, which was at the picket lines kind of in central London, which was like a really great opportunity. Yeah, you can do things like ask your faculty for kind of funding breakdowns. I'm sure there's loads of routes to kind of keep this conversation going.
Yeah, and I definitely agree with Jade on the point that this sort of stuff isn't just limited to the academic sector. There's a lot of other trade unions that organise other workers that still work within the university system. So, organisations like Unite and Unison are quite active in Oxford. There's student campaigns like Oxford Worker Justice that work a lot on the living wage issue and on working conditions for other staff that aren't sort of academic staff. And I think the problem is really multifaceted across sort of every single sector and group of workers. They face similar working conditions, and I think that speaks louder than kind of anything else. Is just every type of person working within a university is facing these kinds of problems of being overworked, underpaid, and just not getting the treatment and respect that they deserve as staff. And I think as students, we should sort of sympathise with that for not only our sake and kind of our educational experience, but also the experience of all the students that come after us, and sort of what education system we want to leave behind for them. So if you guys don't have anything else to add, that concludes our panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining, everyone. This will be available online as well. And thank you again to Jade and Safa and Izzy for your invaluable contributions. I think this is one of the first panels of this kind that we've sort of been able to have in Oxford. And I think they're all really important issues.
Thank you.
Yeah. I wanted to eat grapes this whole time.
I wanted to heckle you guys so much.